Hi everyone, and welcome to Noona's Noonchi, where I do a deep dive into some of your favorite K-dramas from a mental health perspective. I had to go back to Reply 1988 because there's so many wonderful examples of filial piety, family, friends. I could go on, but in episode 5 particularly, I want to point out something since we're talking about filial piety, and I think this is a good example. Now, normally I talk about examples where I want you to learn from. This particular scene in episode 5 was just real. I wanted to point out the emotional turmoil, distress, pulling at the heartstrings of just how much agony that Sunwoo's mom must have experienced through her mother-in-law, or from her mother-in-law, or because of her mother-in-law. And the truth of the matter is, I'm going to say this. Big part of filial piety, the stressors surrounding it, right? That duty to serve, the obligation you feel to please, honor your parents, your family, doing everything for them. Nothing really seems good enough. Those are the stressors, right, that we put on ourselves and that we expect the expectations in an Asian family. Well, Sunwoo doesn't have a dad, so Sunwoo's mom's bringing up her 2 kids, Sunwoo and Jinju, by herself. And she's one of those, I would say, out of all the neighborhood moms, Reply 1998, she's the most chillaxed, I believe. Pretty chill, goes with the flow, lighthearted. I really like her. She's the least intense. So this scene blew me away in the sense of, whoa, wow, she's really letting it out. Again, not the example that I would say, hey, do this, but more of an example of look at it, episode 5, where she just gets really real, says it all, puts her mother-in-law in her place, and that had to happen for boundaries. I mean, a big part of what we're talking about when it comes to filial piety is putting in healthy boundaries. We'll say this, we'll have to do a whole series on boundaries. But again, what she says, and she literally confronts. It's a heated, emotionally charged, she yells. And I'm talking yells. At her mother-in-law. And leading up to that, I mean, you're watching it, and mother-in-law is, maybe you had this situation. You are being spewed insult after insult, injury. It is just harmful, distressful, really, really saying terrible things about her as a mother, her as her son's wife, and saying really terrible things like, gosh, I have to deal with you for the rest of my life. How are you taking care of my kids or my grandkids? And this is where I want to say, despite the pressures that she may have felt to still serve her mother-in-law and still mourn the death of her husband, right? She literally flat out says, I'm going to raise my kids. I'm the parent. I'm going to do my best. Even if I can't give them all like the name brands or all these glorious things, they don't necessarily need that, but I'm going to make sure that they're well taken care of, and that's what I'm doing. And she says it adamantly, but again, she shouts. Just watch the episode, because how you relate is just very emotionally real. Authentic in that sense. All of us have been there, maybe not with in-laws, because I don't know if you're necessarily married, but even not. You might have been there with your parents, where you just want to say what Sunwoo's mom's saying to your mom, dad, uncle, aunt, grandparents, or in-laws. And there comes a time that you have to. So why I like this, the example would be, is even though it was really hard to hear these things, I believe what got her out, the roar that came out, the mama bear, she was saying it in front of her own daughter. And that's very different, right? When you're being yelled at in front of your own kids by another adult, it is shameful, and something else can kick in. And I think at that moment, perhaps the motivation she had was that her daughter was sitting on her lap and she was saying horrible things. And then I really like the fact that she brought in her own mother. She has a different relationship with her mother, a pretty good relationship, right? But she brought in the fact that I'm my mother's daughter, and to hear another mother say this to a daughter or daughter-in-law, right? Or to a child, in this case an adult child, is terrible. I mean, she was just saying my mother would be so hurt hearing this. I really like that. I think that's important to show different family ties, wherever you're coming from. So episode 5, when she literally tells her mother off and says, get out, don't come back again. And then her mother-in-law in shock, because here's some shock value. You might as well, if you have to confront and have to say things verbally, and it comes to that, well, I mean, at the very least, you'll get some shock value, right? And I always say this, for second order change, is a family systems term, for change to really shift in the family. That's second order change. That's the change that I go for. That's the change that I want you to go for. that particular heated discussion had to happen. Yeah, I'm pointed like you guys know, like the TV, but she had to say as best as she could for her mother-in-law to get it. You know, there are times when you think you're saying things and people get it and you're like, I think I'm putting those boundaries in place, but they don't get it. And then they keep going. Well, I really believe if she hadn't shouted at the rooftops to her mother-in-law, like, get out of my house, don't come back, I'm going to raise my own kids, how dare you say this, is pretty much what she said. Her mother-in-law would have kept going. But she stopped. I mean, she literally, in a huff, left, right? Gave her some money and saying, take care of my grandkids. The ownership there gets tough. I'm going to say this, if you're a parent watching this, you are the parent, so you are the expert of your child, so you take ownership of your kids. So step up to the plate so nobody else kind of comes in and said, you're not doing this. Say, yes, this is the way I'm going to do that, right? Just because you want to serve your parents doesn't mean you can't tell them and show ownership where ownership is due, right? Take that ownership, especially because it's your kids. I'm pretty sure parents were in the same boat and they may understand that. This is an example of the realness that you may feel. At the very least, you may feel validated watching this. And Sonu's mom did get her wish. The mother-in-law left, got the hint. It wasn't even a hint, got the message. And what I loved at the very end, she gave her back the money that the mother-in-law gave her. And I'm going to be, if you know Sonu's situation, their situation, single mom, not working. They're living off the house and her, her dead husband's, life insurance or whatever, right? But she could have used that money. She definitely could have used that money, but chose not to take it out of principle, but not principle out of anger. More like, no, I'm going to show my mother-in-law I don't need her money, because there's the boundaries of money, right? Let me give you this money, and if she could have taken it, then there's a hint of that boundary where you're bound to me. I gave you that money, you accepted it, so it means that you kind of do want me to come back, right? Well, at that very moment, she ran back after her mother-in-law, gave her back the money, said no. That is important to stay consistent to the message that Sonu's mom was giving the mother-in-law. I hope I'm making sense here. That's just a great example of what could happen or what must happen for things to change and for you to perhaps change things in your family for the good, right? The dynamic of the stress surrounding her mother-in-law and how she made her feel. There's that fine line of making yourself feel bad, or someone making you feel terrible about yourself, and just behavior where it's not making you feel terrible per se, but you just get annoyed. Does that make sense? That's where I think at that moment, she was made to feel terrible. And then she literally gave it to her and said that message. Another dimension of filial piety, the reality of the in-law dynamic, is big. I also dealt with it. Perhaps you're dealing with it. Many years, it doesn't mean it just you have a conflict and everything's done. However, sometimes things need to come to a head. Flames is what I'm seeing, for something to shift in the family. That's second order change, where you literally, the rules governing the family. So maybe the mother-in-law had some sort of, had something over Sonu's mom, right? Always, constantly, even before, when she was married to her husband, before the dad died, perhaps it was always like a thorn on her side. That's what I'm sensing. I don't think it really came from after her husband's death. And don't forget, the mother-in-law is also mourning her own son's death. But I will be honest, I know I have to show empathy, but in this very moment, I think my empathy is on Sonu's mom and what needed to happen for her own well-being. And the sad truth is, and maybe I'll do a react on this afterwards, you see her sad. It comes at a price in the sense of the strength it took to do that, the courage it took, and then the sadness that she felt, right? You see her drinking later, as most Koreans do, showing that, but expressing her her own sorrow, her grief, in losing that relationship with her mother-in-law that could have been different. But that is okay. Part of filial piety, and maybe understanding what needs to shift, is not breaking that duty or obligation, but shifting it. And perhaps at that very moment, not having that obligation or duty at that time. There are many times when there's broken relationships and families, but they can be mended. But then there are times they cannot be mended and maybe should not be mended for the sake of the family. So again, very different dimensions. You have to confront when necessary for change to happen, and it can look like episode 5, dramatic to a T. And that is A-okay. Thanks for watching Noona's Noonchi Deep Dive. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and push the bell button so you're notified of new videos to come.